Great. Welcome, everybody. We're just waiting another minute or two. We already have a question. Will there be a recording available? Yes, there will be, probably in 24 hours or so. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all very much for tuning in to our ISR Insights series today. I'm David Lamb. I'm Director of the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. Very glad you could join us today for the next installment in our ISR Insights speaker series. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ISR, we have over 300 affiliated faculty who, along with our excellent staff, put together research addressing topics such as wealth and inequality, race and racism, politics and public opinion, as well as a wide range of other topics, including teen drug use, economic behavior, aging, and health. Our faculty come from almost every school and college on the University of Michigan campus, reflecting the true interdisciplinary nature of our work. The goal of this ISR Insight Speaker Series is to create a forum for disseminating research findings of our faculty at ISR. So far, we've had 4 excellent sessions. We had one on the educational achievement gap during COVID-19, one on the latest results from the Detroit Metro Area's community study looking at the pandemic's impact on Detroit, one of the nation's hardest hit areas. We had an excellent presentation by Fabian Pfeffer, who recently launched the Center for Inequality Dynamics here at ISR, speaking about wealth inequality over generations for whites and blacks. And most recently, Jessica Finley and Lindsay Kobayashi presented data from their recently launched study looking at mental health and well-being among older Americans during the pandemic. Recordings of all those events are posted on the ISR website, isr.umich.edu, and we'll post information on upcoming talks, as well as the recording of today's talk on that website and on our social media channels. So check those places to stay connected. We've got some excellent events coming up in the coming weeks. So today I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague, Vincent Hutchings, the Haynes Walton Jr. Collegiate Professor of Political Science and a research professor at the Center for Political Studies here at ISR. Professor Hutchings was the principal investigator of the American National Election Study, the ANES, from 2010 to 2017. Today, Vince will discuss the history of insights from the ANES. Since 1948, the American National Election Studies has provided public access data to inform explanations of election outcomes in the United States. The ANS, which is really one of our crown jewels at ISR, provides researchers with survey data from a nationally representative sample of American adults to give researchers a view of the political world through the eyes of ordinary citizens. In today's talk, Vince will discuss why the ANES remains an essential resource for the social sciences. He'll also talk about the study's approach to continuity and innovation in data collection and instrumentation, and he'll highlight politically relevant results from recent studies, including attitudes on the Black Lives Matter movement. A few housekeeping details. Note that live captioning is being provided to today's event. You can turn on those captions by turning on the closed captioning feature on your Zoom screen. Note that we will have Q&A at the end of the presentation. The chat feature is disabled, but the Q&A feature of Zoom is turned on, so you can submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll do our best to have Vince answer your questions before our time ends. So thank you again very much for joining us today. Enjoy the presentation. I'll turn things over to Vince Hutchings. Thanks, Vince.
Thanks. Well, thank you for that introduction, David, and thank you for setting the stage for my comments this morning. I'm very happy to be here virtually to talk about the American National Election Study. I was, as I think David indicated, the principal investigator, at least the Michigan principal investigator on the study from 2010 to 2017. I'm not affiliated with the project anymore, but I remain obviously a user of the data and also just connected to it in part because of my previous status with the project. So I'll be talking about the project from the vantage point of my time serving as one of the principal investigators, and what I understand is the direction the current project is taking, even though I'm no longer affiliated. So I think it's probably prudent to begin by starting with the history of the project. David's already made a bit of a reference to it, but I'll talk for a few more moments about it as well. The project really began what would later become known as the American National Election Study in 1948. And it was in that year that the study began the process of exploring really why people vote the way that they do. And by doing so with nationally representative survey data from the 48 contiguous states, the design of the study from the outset has relied upon a pre-election phase and a post-election phase. So respondents are sampled in the weeks prior to the November election, and then they're recontacted in the weeks following the November election to get their assessments about how things have unfolded. It's a massive undertaking that's, well, been done by the university since the 1940s and into the 50s. At the initial design of the study, it had both a presidential component and a midterm election component. So from the late 50s well into the 21st century, or at least somewhat into the 21st century, it covered every midterm election as well. So we were able to gain fascinating insights into how people behave differently and vote differently in the midterm elections relative to the presidential elections. But we've discontinued that as of 2002, in part because the National Science Foundation thought we had kind of reached the limits of what we knew and needed to know about midterm congressional elections. I can say more about that if someone's interested in Q&A. But overall, the project, which has been known as the American National Election Study, I think for about 15 years now, it had previously been known as the National Election Study, and before that, just the Michigan Election Studies. But in any case, the American National Election Study is considered the gold standard in political surveys in and outside of the academy, in part because of the great care and precision that is brought to bear on the construction of the questions. There's a whole science behind how to appropriately design questions in order to elicit the most accurate responses from respondents. So it's the care and precision of the survey questions, and also really one of the chief virtues of the project is the repeated time series component, wherein questions, identically worded questions in many cases that were asked in the 1950s are asked even now into the 21st century. And this allows us an opportunity to assess the extent to which attitudes have changed. Obviously, if the questions are unaltered, then we can make apples to apples comparisons between attitudes in the 1960s on some dimensions, some of which I'll talk about later in my comments this morning, and attitudes today. How much has changed and perhaps how much has not. Another thing I want to at least briefly mention is the comparative studies, the comparative study of electoral systems. This is something that's an outgrowth of the American National Election Study. It is in part a consequence of the inspiration that the American National Election Study has provided to other election studies around the world. The ANES is the first election study of its kind. And it has been duplicated in a number of countries around the world that have also sought to develop ways to evaluate the health of their democracies. And so as a consequence, in the mid-1990s, researchers here at Michigan and around the world came together with the idea that it would be useful to develop a kind of a conglomerate of election studies so that we can make comparative analyses about different factors that are emerging in different polities around the world, issues involving populism, women's rights, et cetera, et cetera. And so the CSES has participating countries develop a kind of a common set of questions that are then archived together and allow for researchers to make more global assessments about how democracies, or even countries that may not be classified as democracies, how attitudes are changing or not over time. What are the factors, economic and otherwise, that are associated with those changes? And perhaps most relevant, this data is provided for free in a kind of single archive. So this is one of the many, I guess, positive products of the project over time. There's much more to be said, and I'm going to drill down in my comments this morning into some of the more recent studies and some of the insights that have derived from those studies. Now, one thing that has changed in recent years with the American National Election Study has been the collaboration with Stanford University. At the outset of the project in the late 40s and early 50s, it was a completely Michigan affair. But that has changed over time. I'll just say quickly, as of, I believe, 2005, the project is now a joint collaboration with Stanford University. And the current principal investigators of the project at Michigan would include my colleague, Ted Brader, and at Stanford would include my friend and colleague, Shanto Iyengar. There are also associate PIs on the project who do a lot of the heavy lifting as well in terms of designing the study and preparing the data, et cetera. So these individuals, you see they're listed on screen: Nick Valentino here at the University of Michigan, Sunshine Hilligus at Duke, and Darren Shaw at the University of Texas, Austin. The organizing structure of the ANES, I'll just say briefly, also involves a set of advisors. Essentially, these are scholars from around the country who have expertise in particular areas of political behavior, like the study of religion, like gender and politics, like race and politics, like economic inequality. So the principal investigators solicit experts from around the country to sit on the board of advisors to provide them insight into the designing of the questionnaire and what directions the project should be moving as it prepares, for the next presidential contest. So, having given a little bit of the structure, the influence, and the origins of the project, I want to say a few words now about what is the driving question. I've already kind of alluded to it, and to some degree, I suppose it's a bit obvious because it's an election study at the end of the day. But what are the fundamental questions that have, since the founding of the project, kind of driven the research questions? And of course, this would be perhaps first and foremost, not simply assessing which candidates voters select, but trying to get a sense about what are the factors that go into that selection. So candidate evaluation, candidate selection, why voters prefer one candidate as opposed to another, is really one of the two fundamental questions that drives a project. There are other questions or other kind of motivating goals as well, but the two questions I'm about to highlight are the ones that are really at the core of the project. Candidate evaluation, candidate selection on the one hand, and participation on the other. That is to say, some Americans decide to participate in the electoral process, either with voting, but also in terms of putting up yard signs or participating in rallies or donating to candidates, et cetera, and others do not. So the study, in addition to assessing vote choice and candidate preference and candidate evaluation, is also charged with understanding the factors that motivate participation. and not just participation with respect to voting, but also participation in terms of a range of different um, manifestations, like working on campaigns, for example. We have sought to answer these questions in the design of the survey with nationally representative, high quality, typically face-to-face interviews since the inception of the project. So I said in an earlier slide that the project is often referred to as the gold standard of political studies, and that's in part because of the high quality questions and the scholarly input that goes into the questionnaire design, but it also has something to do with the high quality of the sample that we collect. So it is an extremely high quality sample that is derived from the 48 contiguous states, and with the online component of the study, which I'll talk about later, it includes all 50 states. And given the quality of the data, the quality of the questions, it's an extremely lengthy survey as well. It's about, on average, about 80 minutes in the pre-election phase and about 80 minutes in the post-election. There's really nothing like it. This is not the equivalent of a 10 to 15 minute, telephone survey. Okay, so the value of the study. So the ANES was funded continuously by the National Science Foundation since 1977. Prior to that, the PIs, most famously Warren Miller, was looking for support every election cycle. And remember, in the earlier days, that meant every 2 years, not just every 4 years. So that was obviously a very exhausting process. And the National Science Foundation support that came in the late 70s was really a boon to the project and an indication of its iconic status in the profession. The data is used very widely. I won't say much about that, but it is worth noting that the ANES is not the personal, it's not the personal kind of enclave of the principal investigators, but it's really something that we are guardians of on behalf of the research community and the user community. So consequently, the PIs do not get privileged access to the data. Once the data has been collected and cleaned and made readable and usable, it is then made available to everyone at the same time for free. And that is precisely as it should be. And it's actually to the benefit of the project and allows, therefore, for the most wide-ranging analysis of the data. All right, so I've talked a lot about the project overall. So now in most of my remaining comments, I'm going to talk in more detail about the specific studies that I was associated with. I was also associated with the 2008 study, not as one of the principal investigators, but as one of the associate, actually as the associate principal investigator. But I'm nevertheless going to speak primarily about the 2012 and in particular the 2016 study to give you an overview of some of the information and insights that the project was able to derive in that time. Now, as is true for the project since its inception, the 2012 study also included in-person interviews. Actually, we had an oversample, which I'll talk about momentarily. But one of the things that was innovative about the 2012 study is we also had what we called an internet companion study. So we collected online interviews, self-administered interviews with a probability sample. And we were able to marry that with the face-to-face study in order to increase quite dramatically the size of the study and to assess the feasibility of doing such a lengthy survey in a self-administered online format. In any case, in terms of the raw numbers in 2012, there are over 2,000 in-person interviews, which is that's pretty big because typically we were in the range of about 1,500 or so, maybe 1,200. So a 2,000 person interview, in 2,000 plus in-person interviews was relatively large for us. But because of the cheaper nature of internet surveys, we were able to do even more cases online. as I've alluded to previously, the 2012 study was not the first to have oversamples, but it was, I believe, the first one to have both Black and Latino oversamples. Of course, the survey was also done in English and in Spanish. So this allowed for a much more involved analysis of these two subpopulations. And this was obviously relevant because of the increasing relevance of immigration issues, and of course, because of the candidacy in 2012, the re-election bid of Barack Obama, the first president of African descent. So just to give you a sense about the numbers in person, they are what you can see there on screen. Again, these were oversamples, so not simply reflecting their numbers in the population, but sampling a greater number in order to have enough to do detailed analyses. This really allowed for perhaps the biggest, the largest number of both Black and Latino respondents, perhaps since the inception of the study. So we're really proud about that, and during that very consequential election in 2012. Something else I want to highlight about the study is one of the main challenges, perhaps the main challenge of the study, which is that we've got this great data and this great ability to compare across time, but at the same time, we're trying to get an understanding of a particular election cycle. So consequently, there's a tension that is built into the process between continuity on the one hand, maintaining the same questions, that is, so we can make comparisons over time, and innovation on the other hand, developing instrumentation that assesses the particular issues that arise in a particular election cycle. On the continuity side, the kinds of questions that are repeated in the study are the ones you might expect: questions on vote choice, questions on turnout, partisan identification, which is a concept, of course, that was developed here at the University of Michigan, ideological identification, levels of political knowledge, attitudes about the candidates, and a range of other questions, including questions about the economy, of course, which is typically the most prominent issue in the campaign. So these kinds of questions, we are asking them repeatedly, and consequently, they take up a lot of real estate on the questionnaire. And they don't change, or at least they don't change dramatically over time. But we also want to have innovation. We also don't simply want to ask the same questions over time. We want to ask new questions that assess new conditions that arise over time. And in the 2012 study, there were a number of innovations I want to draw your attention to. One of which is derived from the psychology literature. This is the 10-item personality index, or the TIPI scale, and which I'll talk a little about in some detail in a moment. And then we have questions about discrimination, and we also had questions about media usage that were revamped, and a few other items, some of which I'll get a chance to talk about as well, including, this is not a question per se, but it was an observation made by the in-person interviewer about the skin tone of the respondent, which is distinct from, obviously related to race, but not the same thing. Here we were assessing relative lightness or darkness of skin color with an effort to see whether that was associated with political judgments, policy preferences, etc. We did this, by the way, not just for Black and Latino respondents, but for all respondents in the study. And the 2012 study also relied far more heavily than previous studies on computer-assisted self-interviewing. The idea here is that for some sensitive questions, instead of the interviewer asking the respondent, the interviewer would turn the tablet over to the respondent, and he or she could answer those questions with some level of confidentiality, which had not previously been present. The idea being that they would be more forthcoming and more honest as a consequence. So I made a reference earlier to the 10-item personality index, and I'll give you a sense about what those items are here. I'm not going to talk about any results derived from it, but I just wanted to give you a sense about how deriving insights from sister disciplines like psychology or sociology or economics can help us perhaps gain new insight into the electoral process. And so with the 10-item personality index, the goal here was simply to see whether personality traits like extroversion or agreeableness have implications for how people evaluate candidates, the policy preferences that they may endorse, or their proclivity to engage in various forms of electoral participation. I'm not going to walk through all of this in detail. The point here is that we adopted the scale from psychology with an aim towards maybe getting an insight that we did not previously have about how voters perceive the electoral arena. Okay, I mentioned computer-assisted self-interviewing and how that was a useful tool, particularly with more sensitive questions. And among the more sensitive areas that we have in public opinion writ large would be questions involving matters of race. So we use the computer-assisted self-interviewing technique with many of the questions about race, some questions about religion and sexual orientation as well. But I'm just going to give you a flavor for one of the newer questions we introduced in 2012, which was about perceptions of discrimination in the country with respect to a variety of different groups based on race, but also based on sexual orientation. And of course, this is especially relevant. I bring this question up because of the nationwide protests we've seen unfold across this summer. The fact that we have questions of this sort from 2012 will allow us to make comparisons with 2020 to see the extent to which perceptions about these matters have or have not changed over the last several years. This is the question. We asked it again about whites, blacks, Hispanics, groups to which the respondent belonged and groups to which the respondent did not belong, with an eye towards seeing if there was any differences across the various groups and how this may be associated with vote choice and participation. I made a reference also to the skin tone measure. I'm not going to talk about results associated with it here, although I'm happy to do so in Q&A if anyone is interested. It turns out that there are some associations between skin tone and vote preference and also policy preference. But for now, I just wanted to show you the measure. This measure, which we did not develop at the ANES, is actually developed by a sociologist at Princeton, was a visual cue that the respondent did not see. Only the interviewer would see this and make a judgment based on their visual assessment of the interviewee, the respondent, and where they were arrayed on this 10-point scale. And again, that's because there's a big literature in public health and sociology, and to some degree now in political science, suggesting that gradations of skin color can be as consequential as can categorical differences of race in terms of determining experiences with discrimination and in terms of policy preferences. Okay. With respect to this issue of perceived discrimination, I just wanted to give you a sense about how the variable is arrayed across the racial groups for whom we had the most cases. The reason I'm not talking about other racial groups beyond whites, blacks, and Hispanics is because we don't have a sufficient number of them to do confident analyses. In any case, you can see here that we find differences that probably map on to what many of you would have expected. There are a non-trivial fraction of whites who do perceive their racial group as encountering discrimination, flirting with about 10%. But still, the vast majority would say none or little. The number gets far larger, indeed surpassing about half when you talk about Hispanics, and roughly 2/3 indicate a lot or a great deal of experience with discrimination for the racial group when you focus on African Americans. So that's just a sense about the distributions. I'll talk a little bit more about associations with vote choice when I get to the 2016 study. By way of summary, The 2012 study had a number of new measures, some of which I briefly talked about: the 10-item personality index, perceptions of racial group discrimination, skin tone observations. I didn't mention some other issues that we also had, such as media usage, income inequality, new questions on affirmative action, the Affordable Care Act. We also instituted a set of questions that we hadn't used previously that was derived from the General Social Survey in sociology, which is known as WordSum, or basically a vocabulary test, to see if respondents who have a more extensive vocabulary might have a different orientation with politics. So we did a number of things of this sort. Obviously, you asked about rumors as well. Another innovation of the study that is noteworthy is the institution of the Internet Companion Study in addition to the face-to-face study. And that allowed us to increase the number of cases dramatically and do far more detailed analysis of Black and Latino respondents. I'll put up this website, or excuse me, this link a few times in the course of my comments this morning. But for anyone who is interested in learning more about the study, you can just go to electionstudies.org and learn about the current iteration of the project, but also about previous election cycles, again, going back to the 1950s and even late 1940s. All right, so now let me talk a little bit about the 2016 study, since that's the most recent study for the American National Election Study. In 2016, we did not have an oversample of in-person interviews, but we did have a large internet online component. And unlike the internet component of 2012, where we relied upon a panel of respondents that had been already developed by a firm, and so it was not a fresh recruit, in 2016, we recruited these individuals for our online panel independently or for our particular study. So it was what we call a fresh recruit. It wasn't using someone else's panel. In short, it was the higher quality internet sample. So we were pretty happy with our ability to do that. We also had a number of new questions. I'm not going to necessarily read through all of these, but we tried to take advantage of the somewhat different political environment. Obviously, Obama was no longer on the ballot. Issues involving Muslims, the protests that had broken out in 2014, I believe, in Missouri and elsewhere regarding issues of police misconduct. We explored that, racial group consciousness, in part because of the Trump candidacy, color-based discrimination, et cetera. The PIs for the 2016 study were myself, as well as Ted Brader, my colleague here at Michigan, and at Stanford, Shanto Iyengar and Simon Jackman. And again, information about the website if you are so inclined to learn more about the project. So one of the questions that was new for 2016 was about discrimination, not based on race in this case, but now based on skin color. Again, because there's a considerable literature in psychology and sociology, and to a limited degree, political science, about how this particular component of discrimination is similar to racial bias, but it is distinct. And it may have implications for politics, which we had not previously explored. So this question you see here on screen had never been previously asked. It was essentially a modification of a question we ran in 2012 that was based on either sexual orientation or race or ethnicity. And what I want to show you on the next slide is simply how this played out across different racial groups. So perhaps not surprisingly, the vast majority of whites do not express any significant experience with color-based discrimination. Latinos, on the other hand, the number starts to get a little bit more consequential, but it really, you can see a significant difference among African Americans. And this is an issue that is quite prominent in the Black community, color-based discrimination, typically, although not always, with darker skinned African Americans experiencing more discrimination than medium or lighter skinned African Americans. And that's what played out here. It was kind of an impressive finding. And there were also some relationships we found with other outcomes. I'll just say very quickly, we found, for example, that darker skinned African Americans were more likely to indicate that they were stopped by the police, which was another new question that we had in 2016. And obviously something relevant in light of what's been playing out this summer. Speaking of what's been playing out this summer, let's talk a little bit about perceptions of racial bias among police, or with respect to police interactions with the mass public. So that was a big issue in 2016, in part because of the killing of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and other incidents that had unfolded around the nation. So as a consequence, we added these questions which had not been previously run in the study. And I'll provide you some insight into these moving forward. So the question you see here is the one we ran with for 2016. We had some others as well, but this is just the one that I want to focus on. In general, do police treat whites better than blacks, treat them both the same, or treat blacks better than whites? Straightforward question. And the response options, if one thought that either whites or blacks were treated better, you were then branched to the question that asked, do the police treat either whites or blacks much better, moderately better, or just a little better? So when the entire scale is put together, it turns into a 7-point scale. And what I'm going to show on the next slide is simply how this plays out across racial groups, but also how it plays out across racial groups within the different political parties, because there are both partisan and racial implications for this question. I'll leave this on screen for a moment to allow you to digest the results. So it is noteworthy, it seems to me at least, that across both partisan and racial groups, there seems to be relatively broad agreement that African Americans are more likely to encounter bias in their experiences or interactions with police officers. That seems to be true both for white Republicans and for Black Democrats. I mean, being over the way that the item is coded, being over the midpoint is an indication that you believe there's at least some bias, anti-Black bias, that the police engage in. But having said that, it's also true that there are differences within party and, of course, across race here. There's a pretty big partisan divide among whites, but even with respect to African Americans, even though there are relatively few Black Republicans, there are some differences in how they perceive this issue. So party does seem to matter here, at least to a degree, and so too does race. But even granting all of those things, it's perhaps somewhat surprising how much agreement there seems to be here. It'll be interesting to see the extent to which this remains to be the case in 2020, or indeed is even more true. Another issue we explored in the 2016 study was the attitudes about the Black Lives Matter movement. We didn't have a lot of questions in 2016. We actually only had this one, which was a thermometer. I imagine most of you are familiar with the thermometer, but basically respondents are asked to array either a group or a politician on a 0 to 100 scale, which I've recoded to a 0-1 scale. And larger values suggest a warmer or more favorable impression, and lower values indicate less favorable impressions, with values closer to 50 indicating neutrality. I wanted to say that before I put all these words on screen. I'm not going to read all this, but they basically convey the point that I just said a moment ago. The thermometer is an effort to assess whether you feel coolly towards a political object, whether you feel warmly towards that political object, or whether you feel neutral towards the political object. And again, I've recoded this variable so that it moves from 0 to 1. On the next slide, what I'll show you again is how attitudes in 2016 vary across racial groups and across partisan groups. And again, it's noteworthy because I'm fairly confident they're going to keep this question for 2020. And therefore, in light of all the demonstrations we've seen this summer, it'll be curious to see what has or has not changed in that ensuing 4 years. So here are attitudes about the mean attitudes for partisan groups and for racial groups regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. And for me, at least, one of the noteworthy things here is how even though there was relatively widespread agreement about the presence of anti-Black bias among the police, there is far more disagreement about whether or not the Black Lives Matter movement is the appropriate vehicle to address that concern. And just to draw attention to this, even Black Republicans were more favorable towards this group than were white Democrats, at least in 2016 on average. And so the issue that comes to mind for me is whether or not this has changed, or as a consequence of the video showing the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis by police officers or former police officers, whether or not these numbers are going to change any. I don't know, but the ANES provides us with a vehicle to make that judgment. In the next slide, I want to show you the impact of the attitudes about the Black Lives Matter movement and attitudes about police misconduct, whether or not any of that had implications for vote choice, which is really one of the core missions of the project. The way I've set things up here, again, things are arrayed onto a 0-1 scale, and the fine print here at the bottom of this table, I don't necessarily expect you to read, but the point is that we're looking at vote decisions, Clinton relative to Trump. We're only looking at the two-party vote. And we're controlling for the things that researchers usually control for, demographics like age and income and education, as well as economic perceptions, measures of racial resentment, which is really just a measure of racial conservatism, even holding all of those things constant. What we're going to look at is the impact of ideology, the impact of partisanship, and the impact of attitudes about Black Lives Matter and the perception that police engage in racial bias misconduct, which is what I have shown here. And these coefficients, I'll convert them into probabilities momentarily, but the relevant point at the moment is simply that even taking into account partisanship, even taking into account ideology, as well as all the demographic and attitudinal factors I mentioned a moment ago, even taking these into account, attitudes about Black Lives Matter and police, perceived police misconduct, racial misconduct, had an impact on the vote choice. And that impact was not trivial. Here on this slide, I show you the predicted probabilities. This is with holding all other variables in the model constant at their mean or their median. And in the case of perceptions of anti-Black police bias, I'm only going from, because relatively few respondents thought that the police showed anti-white bias. That was maybe less than 10% of the respondents. So the vast majority of people, or probably the plurality, were either in police are unbiased or police demonstrate anti-Black bias. Consequently, you can see that there is a non-trivial impact on the vote share, moving from a perception of unbiased police behavior on the one hand to the perception that police are much more likely to treat whites better than Blacks. And that's a swing that's not at all trivial. That's a pretty big movement, particularly when you take into account that this is holding partisanship and ideology and demographics constant. I believe this is the next to last slide, so we're almost concluding here. In this case now, I look at the impact of the Black Lives Matter rating on support for Clinton, moving from 0 to 1, 1 here being the equivalent of 100. And we can see that the effect is even sharper. This is a pretty stark effect for a movement that was not as prominent then as it is now. And nevertheless, the impact is really quite striking, at least to me. Clearly, these factors were important as people were casting their ballots in 2016 It had implications for levels of support for Clinton relative to Trump, perceptions of police misconduct on the one hand, but perhaps especially attitudes about the Black Lives Matter movement. So, in conclusion, I would like to highlight the fact that the American National Election Study has been a valuable tool for several decades, really in the post-war period, post-World War II period. Again, it is the first national election study of its kind. It is the inspiration for comparable projects around the world. And it is the gold standard for political evaluations. But it is also something more important than that, because it is a means by which we can assess the health of our democracy by assessing perceptions of trust in government, or by assessing levels of political efficacy, or shifts in partisan identification, or attitudes about race and or gender. We can assess how these things have changed over the last several decades precisely because we have identical or at least comparable instrumentation going back a generation or more. The 2020 ANES, I'll just say something briefly about this since I'm not directly involved with the project, but I know a bit about what the researchers, the principal investigators have planned. The 2020 ANES will provide a number of innovations and ask about a number of things that we would expect. But one thing I definitely want to highlight is that in light of the COVID-19 situation, the 2020 ANES will be the first one in which there will be no in-person interviews. It just would not be feasible for understandable and obvious reasons. However, as a substitute, the principal investigators will be interviewing some respondents via video link. So there will be interviewers involved. And for others, there will be the self-administered web surveys of a sort that I've already discussed in the 2012 and the 2016 studies. Substantively, the 2020 study will focus on, well, what you would expect it would focus on, which would be the biggest issue in the country, the pandemic. There will be questions about that, undoubtedly, but also questions about civil unrest. Speaking with the principal investigators some time ago, they mentioned that the ANES was going to resurrect questions that were run initially in 1968, given the turmoil in that election cycle, and they were going to rerun the identical questions in 2020 in order to have a kind of a comparison across the two time frames. And I think that would be quite noteworthy. Obviously, we're also in the midst of a almost unprecedented economic downturn, and consequently, the study is going to be exploring that as well. So there's much interesting, much kind of tantalizing results that are on the horizon with the 2020 ANES, and I certainly look forward to seeing what the researchers uncover with this most recent iteration. And I guess I'll end on that note. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Vince. We have a few questions in the Q&A if you want to look at them. Maybe we just jump in. There's a question about how the trade-off between adding new questions and keeping old questions, which I know from having run a panel study is always a big issue. How do you deal with that, and roughly how much of the content is still the same as it was in 1948?
Ooh, good question. So I'll take the second one first, and it'll probably be more efficient, David, if you can just read those questions instead of me everyone watching me read the question and then trying to answer it. So in 1948, there's a little bit of a controversy as to exactly when the study began. The first set of questions, and I think it was just 2 or 3, began in 1948. So that's why we often look to that as the beginning of the project. But in terms of a more full-fleshed project, it's really 1952 where they started the questions, and at least some of those questions, including trust in government and, of course, party identification, the precise question wordings in those cases have been preserved even into the 21st century. So the short answer is that there aren't a lot of questions that have the identical question wording from 1952. or certainly from 1948, but there are some. And in terms of how much of the real estate of the survey is devoted to repeated question wording, probably about roughly 2/3. I mean, there's a lot of questions about media, trust in government that you can't just reinvent the wheel every election cycle. So,
yeah, interesting. Let me combine next question with one of the later questions about whether you do vote validation, whether that's affected by mail-in voting, and there's also a question about the party ID and what you do with independents. I assume those are just self-reported party ID.
yeah, the party ID question I'll answer first because it's easiest. It's so this is just party identification is a psychological orientation. It's not about your registration or if you're a card-carrying member of a Republican or Democratic Party. So that's simply that identical question has been used since at least 1948, if not 1952. And it's just the respondent places him or herself on the 7-point scale. In terms of let's see, the first question was about
voter, whether you verify voting.
So the project has frequently throughout its lengthy history had vote validation components where the respondent would indicate that he or she voted in the election, and then they would simply go back, because this information is or can be made public, to see whether or not there was a correspondence between their claim and what the records indicate. So yes, we have done that in the past, and yes, it is a worthwhile thing to do, but it is not as straightforward as you might expect, because of course, is William Smith and Billy Smith, are they the same person? How do you know? What happens if they move? The changing in terms of how one spells one's name. There are implications that arise which are not trivial. So where I think voter validation is definitely a worthwhile thing to do, because there is a documented tendency for people to claim that they voted when in fact they haven't. Not even necessarily because they're being duplicitous, but because maybe they routinely do vote. And so you ask them a couple of weeks or months after the election if they did. They wanted to, they usually did. They say that they did, but maybe they didn't. So, it can be messy, but it's a worthwhile thing to do.
Well, but very related question from Chris Aiken says, voter turnout looks to be crucial in the coming election. Surveys have challenges in measuring it. Some of your competitors reported 2016 turnout rates above 90%, while the truth was closer to 60%. ANES has generally done better, but it's a tricky question. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, Chris has hit on one of the, even though it's one of the core missions of the project to assess voter participation, including turnout, but not exclusive to turnout, it is nevertheless true that the project has fairly routinely overestimated participation. There's been some debate in the literature as to whether that is a consequence of the sample, that there's something about our sample that is not as ideal as it could be, and consequently we're oversampling people who participate, or if the act of engaging in an 80-minute pre-election interview prompts people who might not ordinarily be inclined to vote to go out and vote. So that is a difficult nut to crack. It may well be that there's some element of both of those. We have tried to, and Chris knows about this, we have tried to modify the voter participation question in order to make it more socially desirable for the respondent to admit that he or she did not vote. We would say such things as, well, we realize that sometimes people want to vote but don't have an opportunity because their car breaks down or they can't get away from the job or what have you. So now, what about this election cycle? Did you vote? And that does seem to have some utility in reducing overreports. But even granting that the study we did overpredict vote turnout, we're pretty good when it comes to predicting how people vote and how that matches up to the official records. We've been very good on that dimension. But when it comes to turnout, yeah, we overestimate routinely. For what it's worth, many other studies also overestimate routinely.
Yeah, interesting. So maybe one more question. There's several questions about about sampling, one question about the use of the term gold standard and what kind of sampling is used, and then also questions about how that's going to work in 2020.
So the project, because it's a face-to-face study, or at least has been throughout most of its history, has relied upon cluster sampling. It's more feasible, and so this is just based on population density, and that's one of the reasons why we would focus on the 48 contiguous states and not Alaska and Hawaii. And that makes sense, and there's all kinds of science suggesting that that's a perfectly reasonable procedure to rely upon. However, with the current 2020 circumstances, given that there will be no in-person interviews, it's not obvious to me that they're going to be relying on a cluster sampling. It is worth noting, and I certainly want to highlight this point, the 2020 online sample will be probability based. It will not be an opt-in survey where we employ some algorithm after the fact to approximate representativeness. That's not what the study has ever done, nor will it be doing that in 2020. So the sample will be drawn using probability-based principles, probably not cluster sampling, simply because it doesn't make as much sense for an online sample. But so this will be somewhat uncharted territory for the study.
And then just someone asked when the 2020 data are likely to be available. Of course, you're not in charge, but on past experience, you guys have a pretty good record of getting the data out quite
Yes,
fast.
researchers are really interested in getting access to this data as soon as possible. So as a rule, we try to get an early version of it available by, say, March of the following year. It may well be, this is a very tentative response, so don't hold the project to it, but because the data will be all online this year, it's possible that the cleaning process, as it were, might run more smoothly, and therefore they might be able to release it sooner. But obviously, I'm not speaking on behalf of the project when I say that. At a minimum, the data is typically available in the spring of the following year.
Which is quite impressive, and it does a great job. And I should say, any of you out there can download the data this afternoon and play with it. It's something we're very proud of in ISR, that our surveys we make publicly available without, as Vince noted, even giving privileged access to the principal investigators. And it's something that we're very proud of in ISR, and ANES is a great example of it. So the data are up there and you can download them and play with them. So let me wrap things up. Thanks very much to Vince Hutchings for a fascinating look at the history of ANES. Amazing project over many years, and as you can see, really stays right up to the moment with hot issues, as well as keeping the continuity over time. So thanks you all for joining. We'll have another installment of our ISR Insights series in 2 weeks, so watch for updates. The video from this presentation, like the other presentations, will be available on the ISR website. So thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe. Thanks, Vince.
Take care.